And that this is our first effort at writing a book together, and we're very pleased at how it came out. It shows a lot of that kind of diligent research. Somebody who doesn't just skim the surface, but digs in deeply, far more deeply than often appears in the book. You do 10 times the research that actually shows up, but we know that we're correct on what we've done. The main characters in the book are based upon real concepts.
How did you decide who would write which character? So this is really interesting because this book, so a lot of times there are books that are collaborations between authors in which they both work on the whole thing. This book is different in the sense that we decided from the outset that we would write the book as in two distinct literary voices. First encounter or close encounter type of plot in which people meet aliens, figure out who do what. And that wasn't very hard for us to figure out because Drew is probably the more creative writer of the two of us. And I'm probably the better writer of a good pot boiler plot, a book that will keep you reading, that you're really interested in, that you really want to know where the characters are. So I wound up writing the people, and Drew wound up writing the aliens.
One of the things that I have enjoyed as much as anything else is the deep skill as a storyteller that he has. His first two novels told me very much that. He really understands how to plot out a cliffhanger of a book, how you're never quite sure who is necessarily the villain, which direction the story is going to go. My fun, I have been a science fiction writer for many decades now. I started way back, as I've joked before, in the Stone Age. I love science fiction. I love the idea of creating new and different characters that bring a totally unique view to any encounters with humans. And this was just too much fun to pass up. So we had wonderful fun writing.
Are any of your characters based on real people? Well, that's an interesting thing. Yes, in two ways. There's numerous characters in this book and in my past books that literally have, with people's permission, their real names. There are characters that have aspects or parts of the personality of people that I know or I have met in my experience. What is my sort of overwhelming desire, in a way, in writing fiction, is trying to write fiction that's as real as possible, that's as authentic as possible. That's quite a challenge when you're writing science fiction. I try to write about characters and people based on people I have met in my work.
Now, the aliens, on the other hand, since we don't have individuals that we know that are like them, we work with archetypes. We work with the kinds of characters that would make up a civilization that is fairly sophisticated. So we have scientists, we have leaders, we have military characters, we have nurturers, and we put them
explorers.
Explorers, and we put them all together into the best we can come up with in the kind of civilization that such characters would create around them. We've got another question here, so let's answer this one. Your book cover shows an octopus. Is that just a random choice, or does the story actually feature an octopus? If it does, how did you decide on that particular sea creature? The answer is yes. I don't want to give away too much about the book because we kind of like you to read it, but the fact is that we looked for the potential for an undersea creature that had the possibility of great intelligence.
Really asking the question, which maybe all these close encounter type of plots ask. They all challenge the basic question is, what if we suddenly weren't the top species on our planet? But we live with this kind of arrogance, human beings do. Mm-hmm. There's no other human species. We killed them off eons ago. There's just us. We're the most intelligent species. We're the most dangerous predator, period. By any measure, we can kill everything else that lives here one way or another if we want to, and we know that. We are completely dominant on this planet. And that breeds a kind of arrogance in our species that we're not even aware of. It's part of our DNA.
Absolutely lovely, Sarah. Thank you very much for your comment. We're excited about it. We really are excited about working with Edge, which is a great publisher and very hands-on and very collaborative with us. I will comment that back in the 1970s, when my first two novels came out, it was basically the publisher gave me an advance and said, go away, and we're doing everything, and you'll get a little money in royalty down the line if the book sells, and that was it. And this is a very exciting way to do it. I think it's the way the publishing industry overall is probably going, and we're really pleased to be working with them. Science fiction fans, I can speak for myself for sure. I started reading science fiction when I was about 8 years old. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and the library had a kids section that had some kids science fiction. And after I read that for several months, I read everything in the library and managed to convince the librarian that I should be able to read adult science fiction. Great pleasure and honor of meeting Heinlein once back in the 70s. I briefly wrote back and forth with Isaac Asimov back even a little bit earlier than that. And I at one point met Ray Bradbury, who asked me for a copy of my first sci-fi novel, Pilgrimage, that came out about 1980. So I've been at this a long time. I like other things too. I've written a couple of Vietnam War novels. I am right now working on a murder mystery, but I think at heart I'm always a sci-fi writer.
For me, I probably didn't. I wouldn't call myself an ardent science fiction fan. I read a lot of science fiction, but mostly starting as an adult, and not sort of as a kid going at it. Although I've always been a huge fan of science fiction films. I love science fiction films. I watch them all the time. But I sort of in my college years, I started to read a number of like European writers like Italo Calvino, the Italian writer. And then I read Philip Dick. I've sort of come at it more from an intellectual interest in different writers, but not like I read one science fiction book after another or a series of books after another. I certainly read a lot of these classics like Dune and by Frank Herbert and so forth. There's all kinds of, there's law enforcement officers, there's an FBI agent, there's all kinds of interesting people that show up in this thing. There's even a moment in which the President of the United States, but I won't tell you whether it's this President of the United States or maybe another President of the United States, but where the President of the United States has a few things to say about this situation. And there's a couple of spy agencies around the world who suddenly become very interested in what happens in this encounter, or what is the encounter that's occurring.
Hang on just a minute. She's asking, was it difficult to write a book in two different voices? Let me pause that for just a second and comment that for me, I'm a frustrated scientist. I actually came out to California to UC Berkeley to be an astrophysicist. And I discovered something stunning. Astrophysics requires you to actually have some skill with math. I am a cruddy mathematician. I have very little skill at it, and instead went into journalism and ended up with a master's in creative writing because I love to write about what I can't necessarily explain mathematically anymore. So I love the concepts of stellar evolution. I love the concepts of biology and strange, unusual creatures. I love all of that, and to the best of my ability, I try to understand it. And that's one of the great joys for me of science fiction, is the ability to explore just about every possibility in the world of that kind of writing. The question of was it difficult to write in two different voices, and for me, it was not, in that Barry and I really agreed right from the beginning that for the most part, he was going to write about the human side of it, and I was going to write about the undersea creature side of it. And the only real difference is that we kind of know what humans are like. We have a pretty good idea of the good, the bad, and the ugly of humans, and that's been written for thousands of years. So those stories are there. But as I said earlier, the archetypes of the creatures who are at the bottom of the ocean are still there in our society, and we did some translation of that into their very different but very efficient culture.
I thought doing this was an experiment in writing into literary books. Neither of us had ever done it. It's hard to write fiction. It's a lot of hard work. You have to solve all kinds of problems. You have to struggle with characters. You have to go back and rethink things after you think you've got it. You realize that you don't have it and you need to redo it. And all of that happened, but internal to our own assignment to do each part. So we kind of reacted off each other, but we stayed off of each other's turf pretty remarkably. The book wrote itself pretty easily. That is to say, I didn't find it to be a huge struggle to figure out what to do next.
I think that some of the most fun was the fact that we didn't plot out everything completely in advance, and that we kind of took off on our own and then compared notes.
So I have a question here from Mr. Hendricks. Do you see this as a good versus evil framework, or is it more complex than that? Definitely more complex than that, because good and evil to a species are, I think, as we discovered in the course of writing it, that's subjective. In other words, there are objective concepts of good and evil to people, but generally we think what's good for all people is good. Both of these species believe in concepts of good versus evil, and both of these species see that good and evil from their own perspective, but they're also capable of empathy. They're capable, at least some of them, of thinking about putting themselves in the place of the other species. And that becomes a lot of the complexity of the book.
There is a kind of a line, metaphorical line about people working for what they believe in, that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, and that what one person sees as the absolute right and justification for living is pure evil in someone else's eyes. From Jack Castle, sorry if you already covered this, but how did you guys meet and what made you decide to collaborate together? We talked about the fact that we met back, 2003, 2000, yeah. Right, I think 2003 it was, and we've known each other for a long time. And Barry, I think it kind of started when Barry shared with me the initial manuscript of his first two novels. We talked a little bit after that about, hey, why don't we write a book together? And Barry had an idea for this book, and that's how it came about. So it was it. I don't think it was accidental, but it sort of evolved from our initial meeting. Yeah, I am really pleased to see this finally see print. It has been a wonderful experience. The question from Susan Aguilar, this sounds great. Looking forward to reading it. We had so much fun writing it and we got some good comments from people that have seen bits and pieces of it. But now it's out there all together, and we're hoping that people really see this as a interesting but very different kind of first contact novel.
From Kevin. Hey, so what made you decide to use the setting of the deep ocean? Did the setting come out of the story, or did the story come out of the setting? Well, I'll tell you exactly how it happened. There was a couple of different, the basic idea, which was mine, and I brought to Drew, came out of a couple of things. One, sort of watching what happened with the BP oil spill in the Caribbean in 2006, 7, 8, yeah. Whenever that happened, about 10 years ago. And all the damage that occurred and everything that happened around that. Then secondly, and I was very interested in that, and I've been working on these issues about converting oil platforms to artificial reefs when they run out of time and they're no longer productive, and what the benefits or detriments of that idea. So that was sort of in my head as a general area. Then I was listening to an NPR story one day, and they were interviewing a gentleman who was the head of NASA's Inner Space Program, which is some highly underfunded part of NASA with a tiny budget that explores the deepest part of the ocean. And he said something in the course of that discussion, and I heard it once. I don't even know if it's true or I heard it right. But he said something to the effect of that in the deepest trenches at the bottom of the ocean, which is, miles down, 6 miles down at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean in the Marianas Trench, that there are these deep sea vents, and in and around, and they're all over the oceans, all over the world. And he said something to the effect of, in and around these deep sea vents, the biomass that exists around them is equal to the biomass of like the rest of the planet put together. Well, that's a lot of biomass. Now, it's probably a lot of slimy one-celled biomass, but it's a lot of biomass. And some of that biomass is underneath in those fissures, underneath the surface of the ocean. But that's a lot of living things that we know very, very little about. So it was really from a news story and an NPR story. And then we just took off from there.
I liked the idea from the beginning. I would not have written a story just to be nice to Barry. I really wanted something that seemed to be solid and deep and have some conceptual framework. We know that life is probably more intelligent than we thought it is. We know that elephants are self-aware, chimps are self-aware, as are gorillas and maybe one or two other creatures. But being self-aware still doesn't make them rocket scientists. And
what's our favorite creepy deep sea creature? Well, in our novel or generally, but in our novel, we posit that our creatures view the most dangerous creatures from their point of view as sea creatures that don't seem to eat simply or don't seem to kill simply for food, but seem to kill for the sake of killing.
The other answer to your question is that the creepiest undersea creature that I can think of from other fiction is the kraken, which is actually kind of a gigantic octopus, but completely evil and destructive. I'm sorry, from Timmy Did you collaborate on all of the chapters, or did you alternate writing pieces and parts? Did you edit each other's work? The answer to all of those is yes, which sounds contradictory, but it was frankly a learning process. You know, I have written before as part of a group. I generally hated it. I generally found that I didn't like having to work with somebody else whose idea about what we were putting together might arrive at the same place, but was very different in content. This somehow seemed to be very easy, and I enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, I think it would be much harder to write the same thing together, because then you're really you're not in control of any discrete part of it, or mostly in control of a discrete part of it. This is like, you know, a couple of pianists playing a duet, as opposed to both playing the same, you know, writing and composing the same piece of music and playing it at the same time. It's really, it's much easier. It's a team effort as opposed to sort of writing over one another. I think I write a character and I have to learn about them and what they are and what sort of person they are, and they teach me. Now that's ridiculous, but that's sort of what it feels like to me.
Yeah, and Barry just described my style too. So
maybe that's why we get along.
Our disorganization worked to our advantage in this case.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
What a great evening this has been. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you about what you think about the book.